Well, you guys have just been doing your life. We've been sitting here discussing the stories in Mark, and we've been doing a lot of miracles. Well, we haven't been doing them, but you know what I mean. But we're about to hit, I think, a very important warning, and some of which you covered in a sermon here back in, what was that? That was in October? The 1st of October. About the way we treat each other, and about don't let legalism or other, and I'll make it more broad than legalism, anything creep in and take over your life. But we'll talk about that. Well, I'll start reading at Mark chapter 8. And, actually we never covered verses 11 through 13, now that I look at it. So I'm going to back up there. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back in a boat, and crossed to the other side. Just very briefly, it's kind of a transition passage, and it also sets up his discussion about Pharisees that he's about to do. The Pharisees, by the way, were generally regarded as the good guys. They believed that it was necessary to follow Jesus, rather God, the Father. They kept the law. They wanted to keep the law well. They were, in some ways, a restoration movement for the Jews. But what drove them, the underlying philosophy that drove them, even though they did much good, that philosophy was poison. And here, notice that they're not asking for somebody to be healed. Our deaf friend. In Mark, you've noticed friends brought the guy on the cot to the house where Jesus was preaching. Friends brought the deaf and mute man to him. They're not asking, we have concern, this is our daughter, this is somebody we love, please heal them. It's like, all right, you can do a miracle? Do one. It's kind of like Herod during the series of sham trials before the crucifixion, saying, I've always wanted to meet him and see a sign done by him. No, God's not your trained magician. When he did a sign, it was out of compassion to people and also to let people know who he was. In many years of my life, I was disappointed that we didn't have a God that would just say, okay, and one of them explode. Just to really just nail him. I had an anthropology professor who every day railed against Christians and faith. I kept thinking eventually we're going to get to anthropology, but we really didn't. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many days I thought, God, all you have to do is walk through the room right now. You don't have to do much. I want a sign from heaven. And Jesus is up there going, no, you're not going to get one. That's not what they're about. They're not about, Jesus isn't here to fight your battle for you. He'll fight it with you. But no, that was a selfish thing. And Jesus could have selfishly, and by the way, this sounds very familiar. Wasn't it the devil that said, oh, show me a sign? Mm-hmm. So Pharisees, and going to hear more from you about Pharisees in a bit, but just see if you can see Jesus' frustration with, all right, kids, what have we learned? The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Now, this is an oversight because we know from other passages that women traveled with them who had money and supplied money. If they listened to the women, be careful, Jesus warned them. They pull out their bread, I guess. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And I'm sorry, but I just see 12 guys over there with their head down going, 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? 7. And he said, do you still not understand? Now, here's where, 2,000 years later, sitting at a stage in Brentwood, sending it out to Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Singapore, Japan, Mexico, and all over the U.S., we would like to say, well, tell us a little bit more. How does that work with the yeast of the Pharisees? I think it's a good question, but first of all, Pharisees. Did you want to talk any about definition of Pharisees? We never, by the way, people have asked me several times this last month, say, you guys really work on that to make it go smooth. No, we don't. We don't. We sit down here. Rick is, Dr. Hunter is theologian, a very well-known preacher. He's lived in this word all of his life. I came from a very Pharisaical Christian group, a very narrow legalistic group. I escaped it. I went back in trying to reform and got kicked out eventually. But I'm a scientist wrestling with Scripture. I'm a shrink wrestling with Scripture. So we just sit down, and Dave Cassilly, our tech minister and executive minister, says, go, and we talk. So thank you for being a person I can sit down and have a discussion with.
Oh, man.
With that big setup, is there something we need to know about the Pharisees or what the yeast of the Pharisees means?
These, and for those of you that are looking at other translations or looking at, you get the yeast or the leaven, which is the same thing, and they're working into the text. But the leaven, the yeast of it is, and he talks about of Herod too. He mentions Herod in this too.
And so I see religion and culture, or power.
And so you're getting into more the doctrine of the Pharisees or the doctrine of Herod. Herod's doctrine was immorality. You know, the doctrine. You know, his problems.
Power, right?
His problems have that immoralness, and so it's talking about a doctrine, and it's interesting to keep that word hanging with you, because we use the word doctrine when we're talking about the belief of a religious tradition, and mostly how that doctrine is different from those in another faith tradition, whatever it is. And so kind of keep that in, because it helps you to see what he's trying to do here, because we just use that word different. But the Pharisees, the Sadducees were more the legal arm, you know, kind of, you know, and although they all
legalistic arm. Okay, now I get you. Because they weren't tied to the government.
Right.
Okay.
The more legal. And so now, when they wanted to go attack something other than them, they all ran together as one group.
They did that.
Okay. Now, when they weren't fighting other people, or they weren't going against other people, they start fighting each other. So you have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and stuff like that. And they were different groups, and the Pharisees were more the popular group. The Sadducees would have been more upper, aloof. Pharisees were the boys on the street. They were the guys in the hood. They were the ones, you know, getting the work done. They had the people, and all of them had their kind of flaws, and one of them was they didn't look at what Christ was doing the exact same way. And that's where you pick up Jesus going into the temple and doing certain kinds of things, and one group would say, yeah, go get them, and then the other group, you know, and it was, they just kind of, it's just like a person who grew up in the South may approach their movement through the United States very much different than a person that was born in New York. Just as one person born in California may approach the way they move through this country is very different from a person that's born in the Midwest. Now, when they start sharing ideas and stuff like that, and the person in the Midwest should say, I like what you all are doing out there, and the person out there said, you know what, I like this, that, you know. And so you get that kind of thing, you know, that's kind of going on. And that was, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a little distant bell here that's telling me that the general population were often confused because didn't either Rome or Herod set up a mandatory rotation of who ran the temple? And so sometimes you got Pharisees telling you, and then next time you went to temple, you had Sadducees who didn't believe in the miraculous. They didn't believe in angels or miracles or life after death, really.
Yeah.
And then next time you come around, I don't think Essenes were ever involved. But is that true? Am I remembering correctly?
But it flows along the line of just like he replaced. I think the term is tetrarchs, or just
the tetrarchs. The Greek,
yeah,
the tetrarchs. Yeah.
Just as he replaced those, depending on who was doing the best job, because whatever leader. Well, basically, if you were a leader of whether a religious group or a part of a nation group, the two most valuable things to the Herods was the fact that we don't want any arguing and no fighting going on down there, and make sure your money comes up right. That comes to us. So those are two things. And if a leader, if they could keep the people happy, and stuff like that, they were going to keep their job. They keep the money coming.
The Pax Romana.
Yeah, they wouldn't keep their job, and so and they knew it. That's how come. When Christ and the crucifixion starts coming up, and who do you want me to release unto you and stuff like that. See, part of that is him trying to avoid being terminated and possibly killed.
Exactly.
Over this uproar that looked like. Or when the people, when they start threatening him, if you don't do this, you are no friend of.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So they knew where the buttons were, and stuff like that. And so he would replace those kind of secular leaders a lot. Well, this thing of Judaism was pretty powerful. I mean, it was a pretty powerful tool at that time. And to make those people happy, and they did a lot of concessions to keep them in. How can I handle this so that people love me as a ruler, and all the time, and different things like that. And so there was movement among them. I don't know much about how extensive and things, but I do know that it was, because they were always trying to, placate, whoever was in charge, or the ruler over that section. They were always doing, and the church was no exception, because they were afraid at one point in time. You remember that they were going to lose their ability to rule over the temple and things like that if they didn't stop some stuff that was going on.
Yeah, it's kind of like Constantine fiddled around with the inner workings of the church, but that's not new. Government's always done that, and the government of Herod under the Pax Romana, under Rome, was moving people about so that they wouldn't cause a problem, because, as you said, if you could not keep the peace as a ruler, you were kicked out and sometimes killed. And so Herod was among the most brutal that we can think of there. But it kept the peace, and so he's known as Herod the Great. You're going, I'm thinking Herod not so great at all. Yeah. But all right, the Pharisees, the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. It is, I tell people, it's the easiest thing in the world to become a legalist. For example, I can, and by the way, legalism just means that you prove your favor to God by the things you do. By your law keeping. Let's say that this coming Sunday, we're doing a series, and it's on the Always and Forever Messiah. But if I were just to switch over and say, can we all agree that it's a good thing to pray for 15 minutes every morning? I think everybody in the room would nod their head. Probably everybody out in the world listening, either podcast or viewing, they would also nod their head and say, I also believe that praying 15 minutes every morning will bring us great benefits. And they'd nod. And then I say, and I think God would like hearing from his children for 15 minutes every morning. They're nodding their head. Then I say, well, then I think we're doing wrong if we don't pray for 15 minutes every morning. All of a sudden, I've made a law out of something that was just originally meant for our benefit. It's kind of like they did the Sabbath. The Sabbath was for resting, and they turned it into this really difficult to survive day. That's an overstatement, but they put restrictions, so many restrictions on you. You couldn't turn, and even Orthodox people today will not turn on a light switch because that's work. They prepare all the food ahead of time. Again, I'm not sure that's what God was going for. I could be wrong. But it's easy to let legalism come in and sneak in and sneak in. There was this church we knew, and I won't say it was a major U.S. city. They had decided, we're dropping all of that. We're going to preach freedom in Christ, which you and I would go, yay, good thing. 6 months later, the guy called me, and he goes, we can't get people to come to Wednesday nights. And I said, well, you gave them freedom. What do you expect them to do? You told them that they could be free in Christ, and yet you're still trying to shuttle them through. Wednesday nights are fine. Should they be mandatory? Of course not. But that's one legalism. But there's another one that troubles me a lot more because it's more subtle. There's the yeast or the leaven of arrogance and violence and politics, to where you will get Christians unfriending each other and then not talking to each other, and then homes divided because you voted for that guy, we voted for this woman, you stand there, and there's a Phariseeism, a legalism that has no religious connection at all. It's all about power and politics. That it is so easy to open up Twitter, now called X for some bizarre reason, and decide just to check the feeds for a few minutes, and then 3 hours later, you're mad at everybody. And so it brings me back to C.S. Lewis, and I know I'm dancing about here. I got to turn it back over to you. C.S. Lewis said, if you have a sewer pipe that ends in your living room, the worst possible decision would be to open the pipe. And he was referring there to television and radio from back in the 40s. I think we need to think about our phones, our social media, the news, and also our conversations, and who we're having them with, where are we having them. If we're having them on the street corner where everybody's smoking crack and meth, probably not smart. The leaven will get into us eventually. What was it the old grandparents used to say? If you lie down with dogs, you'll get fleas. All right. So I think the leaven is not something we can say, oh, those people had to watch out. I think that's us. But I think the Herod side, we can say that's power, arrogance, the desire for riches. The Phariseeism is religious arrogance, rigidity.
Absolutely.
So, and like I said, you've preached about this, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah. The one point I want to make out, it shows, the word shows up several times, a few times. But in verse 17, it says, but Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? And I don't know if it was a couple of lessons ago that word hardened came up. But when we're reading through these in Mark, that word hardened is more relational to our word rebellion.
Okay.
Because the hardened is not just, I'm really having a hard time trying to understand this. Can you explain? As opposed to rebellion is I know exactly what you're trying to do. I know exactly what road you're trying to go down to, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and me and whatever from going down that road or from figuring this out or for this to happen. Their heart had been hardened, and so it speaks something to the fact that they're in actual rebellion against God. And I think I had mentioned this before, but we understand it best if you have children, when you look at those children and you have more than one, and you wonder, why does that one, I literally have to light them up over just about everything to do, and to get them to do this and to move this, and you're looking and you're thinking to yourself, I wonder, does this child have an agenda against me? You don't want to think that way, because you have another child that just doesn't have that problem. Okay, mommy, what do you want? Dad, what do you want? They'll go sit in the chair. You want me to be quiet? Go sit over there in the chair. This other one can't, because there's something, and all of us are different. As we all know, if you have a couple of kids, you know they're all over the spectrum. But that word is hard, and there's some sense to it teeter-tottering around the fact that there's rebellion built into us because of sin. Okay, and we have to varying degrees, depending on the talent, that we have to fight that out, because we get hardened. Sometimes we find ourselves being hardened against the very thing we know we ought to be trying to do to make this thing work. And that's when it gets crazy, because have you ever asked yourself, why did you steal this when we've got all this food? At what? And the child, invariably, when they say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Invariably they say they don't know. And we go, as an adult, you ready to go off, if you all understand that. You're ready to snap at this, because you don't need to do it. Why? Because it's something inside. Now, most grow out of those phases. They grow up, but some never do. Some never deal with that thing inside. And so that their hearts has to be dealt with, because that if an individual doesn't come to terms with that surrender to God, then this hardness, this rebellion is always going to be an issue in their life, to the point of personal frustration, maybe even bordering onto this, why am I always depressed about? And you have that field covered. I can only go down so far, and I realize I got to park the car, because this is as far as my studies allow me to go. But even point to that thing, lighting up the depression and all the aspects that come along with it. And one part of it feeds another part of it, and they can't ever get out of that cycle. And then
I'll give you an example. I can remember a young lady that came in. She'd already been to several others to treat her depression, and I was the one they sent people to if the other guys couldn't fix them, right? And that's not meant to be an arrogant statement, because often I didn't fix them either. But she came in, and we worked with all the standard things. I don't do medication because I'm not an MD, but I would work through and she was doing them, still depressed. Well, now there are biochemical reasons for it, and so have you been to the physician? She told me she was. Physician was a good guy. I knew the medication was right. And finally, I looked at her one time and I said, I'm looking in an empty bucket, because everything I have in my bucket to offer you, I've given you. But something's wrong. Can you think of anything you're doing which might be getting in the way of what we're trying to do here? And she sighed and she goes, not really. And I said, how do you spend your evenings? What do you like to do in the evening? Now, this is pre-internet and pre-personal phones. And so she said, I like to read. And I said, that's great. What do you like to read? She read horror novels. Stephen King, Peter Straub, that type of thing. And I'm just looking at her and going, I think we found something. Now, do I believe it's sinful to read that stuff? Nope. But if that's all you're putting in, what are you expecting to get out? There was a horribly gory, awful movie years ago called Saw, which evidently people had to saw pieces of themselves off to get away from a bad guy. And I'm going, who would go see that? I think they're like on Saw 6 or 7 now. And I'm going, all right, they found their market. But here's the thing about your brain, garbage in, garbage out. If you're listening to legalistic people, or if you're listening to music that is anti-women, anti-God, pro-sex, pro-no consequences, it's going to get in you somehow. I've actually eased away, when I was much younger man, eased away from some friendships, never telling them, you're not my friend, but just kind of, I'm going to choose a little bit over here now, because the language and their attitude was starting to get into me. And I decided, something, your head is a sponge. You've got 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, a mouth, all of it information taking in. Maybe I need to move my head somewhere else. And here he's telling him, guys, we've been doing miracles. But who are you listening to that you don't understand the miracles? It's kind of like people in the streets yelling for peace. And I'm going, have you talked to Jesus? Who are you listening to for your peace?
Yeah.
And again, I love the picture of him. How many did we get? 12. I just think that's hilarious. But he's not going to stop doing miracles. He's about to do them again. And in fact, we talked about this a little bit last week.
Yeah.
But before we talk about the blind man at Bethsaida, is there anything else you want to say about Pharisees and leaven?
Just at the fact that in moving through the miracles and Jesus continuing to do them, the reality is that he's bringing them through to realizing that the power that Christ has in this world is not limited to you getting to heaven.
Exactly.
Okay, you getting to heaven, because if so, then we start looking at heaven as otherworldly. We start looking at it as the satisfaction of all the frustration here, and I don't think that that's where that thing is supposed to go. This thing that we're trying to do is live the best life here. You know, like John Piper. I'm not saying this will be your best life, but that's the mission that you go out on, which helps you to hopefully skirt some cynicism and different things that happen. You go through frustrations, you hurt, you deal with that, but you keep the focus on God, not waiting till I get to heaven to fix everything. You know, and that was one of the critiques of Black church. You know, was that, you know, that you are otherworldly. You know, you're willing to take all this stuff here because you said the guy's going to fix it over there. Well, if he fix it over there, then that means he's going to be going at folk over there. And that's not what people want. That's not what that's not what anybody wants. You know, this is a different thing, and so we can't let it. You know, we can't let that rest over there because God's going to get them, and that's not. If so, what are we exchanging this for? This is not that.
Yeah, let's go there instead of having to rush forward, because I think what you're talking about is incredibly important. First of all, nowhere in the Bible does it tell us to be good so we can go to heaven. It's to be good because our Father is good. It is to love because our Father is love. And the first time I realized that, I kind of had to go back and read the Bible again. It kind of like had a different ending, no? But what you're talking about is hugely important. Just to the north and west of here is an estate, the Belmead Estate. And you can come into Nashville and you can tour the Belmead Estate. And over there, they have the slave quarters. When you go through the slave quarters, they have little plaques up to help you understand slave life. Of course, like a plaque could do that, right? But it's there. And on one of them, it talks about one of the early leaders in the Restoration Movement, Alexander Campbell, and his people actually went into those quarters and taught them about God and Jesus. And at first blush, you think, oh, good, except white people told their black slaves, you can come to Jesus, you can't come to our church. And you got to be patient because you're a slave. You'll get heaven later. And that removed the burden of us to treat you as equals and to end the evil of slavery and to end injustice. Because we said, well, God will sort it out later. It's almost like, do you have loaves? Yes. We're keeping those. If the person dies, when they go to heaven, they'll be happy there. And it was this idea of God will sort it out later gave birth to so much horror and mistreatment. And it breaks my heart to think of it. It really does. But when you go back through the old white preachers who were so brave that they preached to the slaves, because they weren't supposed to. I'm glad they preached, but their message was never, let's be free now. It was always, just wait. And I look at it and I wonder, how in the world did nobody see this? Well, a lot of people did, obviously. The anti-slavery movement began. But the common people didn't see it. And we all learned then to not worry about justice because we can just wait until God sorts it out at the end.
Yeah. And there is, a whole genre inside the gospel, called the spirituals, and some of those songs are based on that premise too. There's more than one meaning in the song depending on how you listen at it. Like,
Now that I'm told,
swing low, sweet, sweet, sweet cherry. Okay, God's gonna pick us up like He did Elijah, and we're gonna going to carry it home. That's one side of it. The other side of it is that, as you mentioned, don't acknowledge God, but stay as you are, because it's all going to be fixed down the road. But as you will note, or if you look how gospel spirituals and stuff is today, that they're still highly sang, uh, um, but in a different kind of context.
It's kind of like a future based.
Yeah, you may hear like the Fisk Jubilee Singers or something like that. They may sing something, and noticeably when they do a perform them out that different thing. Normally those are not highly colored audiences, and when I say colored, I mean color spectrum. I'm not talking about black, color spectrum, because people of color never really they gravitated to it when they had it, but as soon as they got past it, there's no current spirituals being produced that I can think of. You know what I'm saying? Because the music did not ring true. And it was locking them up in this right now, because the message that was there, everything's gonna work itself out, over there. And so go through this suffering, and God has it. But there's but you love the melody and the tone, everything about music. I'm not qualified to talk about, but they love that. But those audiences now you go to would not be, you will find all kinds of people in it, but it will not be highly black folk. Just like in another country, it may not be highly there, just because of the fact that it did not ring true, although it's beautiful music that came out at a spiritual time. And those things are not, I don't know readily. I'm sure there's somebody doing it, but they're not produced because the message was off kilter, for what God was doing here, because it doesn't address that rebellion that's just that we talk about, the hardness of heart, that rebellion that's there. People, I can still treat you a certain kind of way, but I'm a good person because I know God. That's what James Cone is the person that started a whole foundation of black theology, black theology. He was the one that got in that. And James Cone said, until you're confronted with what it means to be a child of God, okay, you will never be challenged to change anything in your life or how you're doing it. He said, unless you're willing to pay that price. That was part of the basis, of his writing, until you're challenged. He said that's when you really realize whether you are a child of God, or not, is when you start running into this. What are you going to do to change, as opposed to, okay, it'll be fit, God will handle it down there. He said until you face that inside yourself, you haven't come to where you need to be with God. And he was really adamant about that. We're going to pick up some stuff shortly, probably that's coming up, maybe not on this level, but as I was looking at it, and some of the verses that come up, and my mind went instantly to Dietrich
Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, some ethical, moral things, and things that came up. And part of it was that him returning to his home, to stand foot to foot with the religious people, that were being arrested, instead of living in, quote unquote, the lap of luxury in this country when it was going on. And I think about, him. I mean, this thing cost him dearly.
Yep.
And then all the stuff that happened, and I am not so good a person to say, what, I may have been in on a plot with him, had I been there. I mean,
we never know. We're all people of our time.
You don't. And the suffering, and that's what it means. But this rebellion is all part of it, because that's hard to get, especially if it's ingrained in you. The main thing is like, you can't cut that thing out. like you got a tumor, they work to cut out. And there's not necessarily a medicine that can tone it down, like some of the psychotropics can tone stuff down. This is the thing where you're letting God, come in and say, there's something you need to do in my life, and to see it and acknowledge it, and they struggled with it here. In the apostle, but he was dragging them through it. That's where we get back. He was pulling them through it because they didn't have a foundation to see it. Okay. Sometimes we talk about the God of the Old Testament and the Jesus of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament was war and death and darkness, and he's ready to take your head off in a single. But the Jesus of the New Testament, that's grace, that's mercy, that's the one we love, But that's the same family,
Yes.
It's the same kind of way, and we have to deal with both, how it all comes together.
Yeah, we don't want to end up being like Marcy and deciding they were two different gods. So we have to work with that. I guess what we could do is, to sum it up with a little children's song that I used to hear as a boy, but I've not heard since I was probably 5 or 6. But we would sing it in Sunday school. And be careful, little hands, what you do. There's a Father up above, and he's looking down in love. So be careful, little hands, what you do. And be careful, little mouth, what you say. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. And I don't want people to think that is a legalistic standard that'll save them. I've had people say, well, they acted like they're more holy than me. They'd say, we don't have a television. I said, who else didn't have a television? Genghis Khan. That doesn't make you righteous. You have to decide, what are you taking in? Is it helping you? Is it not? And don't decide for somebody else. You work on yourself. Beware the yeast of religious error, arrogance, and cultural, political power. Because, you have 2 kids, one black, one white. They don't know they're supposed to hate each other. One Jew, one Palestinian. They don't know. They have to be taught that. What if we didn't let the leaven of the world in and we stopped teaching our kids this? But I thank God for you. I thank God he's brought us together. And
Absolutely.
we'll hit it again next week.
All right.
All right. God bless.